Do you have any New Year's resolutions? Do you even care to make any? I like the idea of making small yet attainable resolutions for a new year in order to temper myself into a new person. Now, whether that would be to lose some weight, or find a significant other, or save a little bit more money, or to attain some goal. But for me, for this year, one of my resolutions is to read at least one book each month. And I thought, why not go on YouTube and talk about the book I just read? So this video is exactly that. For January 2023, I read The Family, which is the last novel written by Mario Puzo and completed by his mentee Carol Gino. If you're familiar with Puzo's writing, he's the same guy who wrote the Godfather series of books, which brought the appeal of organized crime, the mafia, to the public. In fact, he even had a role in developing the Godfather movies, which were based on his books. You'll see that The Family was written in a style that evokes the same organized crime feeling as watching Scarface or Goodfellas or The Godfather. Right off the bat, I just want to get this out of the way. My goal here is to share my thoughts on the book, not really to convince you to read it or to make a formal video book review essay. But if you're interested in reading the book about organized crime, or if you wanted to try something new like I do, you're in for a wild ride if you pick up this book. I found this book in a used bookstore for about $7, and considering that it's a hardcover book that's in pretty goddamn good condition, it's really not a bad price. I consider The Family to be a non-fiction drama book about the life of Rodrigo Borgia, aka Pope Alexander VI, and the Borgia family during the late 15th, early 16th century Italy. I say this because a lot of the characters featured in this book have real-life counterparts, but some facts which are obscured in history have been filled in according to Puzo's research and interpretation. So not all of the relationships and events that occur in this story are gospel truth. One of the big driving plot points in this book is the tension throughout Italy and neighboring countries during the Italian Wars that took place during this time period. You had competing rival kingdoms fighting each other to gain control of the whole of Italy. Kingdoms in the states like Spain and France and the Papal States, which includes Rome and were ruled by the Pope, Naples, Florence, Milan, Siena, Venice, etc. They all fought each other from the 15th to the 16th centuries to control Italy, several centuries before Italy was even unified. So that's a little bit of history for you. There was a lot about this book that kind of caught me off guard, and it really began with chapter 4. Right, so when I first picked this book up before buying it, I like to read the little synopsis description on the inside cover to get a feeling of what this book is about, and if I feel that it's worth a read. But from the inside cover, I shit you not, it read like it would have been a lot of wholesome family moments between Alexander and his kids, because the way Alexander is written in this book, he loves his children as much as he does women and all of the finer things in life. But no. Oh no. After reading this book, after reading specifically chapter 4, I think Alexander loved his kids a little too much. Fair warning though, I will be talking about some nasty topics such as incest and graphic acts of violence, including rape. So from that warning, you can get an idea of exactly where we're headed. Strap in, fam. I'm going to start by talking about Alexander VI. Despite being a cardinal rather than later a pope, Alexander was a womanizer. He had at least 7 kids across multiple women, none of whom, meaning the women that he married, because that was against the cardinal law, which are a set of laws set by the church, saying that clergy can't marry and can't have kids. Well, Alexander certainly wasn't the only man of the cloth who had children, but he is credited with being the first pope who would openly claim his children as his own. Other bishops and popes would pass off their children as their nieces and nephews, and the truth would be written away in a letter somewhere that probably became lost to time. This book focuses on the lives of 4 of Alexander's children: Caesar, Juan, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. From the get-go, Alexander would do anything in his power to secure a good, comfortable life of his children. Since he ran the Catholic Church in the Papal States, like somewhere between a king and a pope, it's fair to say that Alexander had a lot of enemies. And due to shifting alliances and politics of Italy versus Spain and France during the Italian Wars, there was an ever-looming fear that some of those enemies might go after Alexander's lineage and wipe out the whole Borgia line. Chief among those enemies was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere and the Sforza family. Interestingly, to maintain power over della Rovere and the Sforzas, Alexander wanted to make his son Caesar Borgia a cardinal at 16 years old, and later set him up to become pope. Normally, when a pope dies or resigns, the new pope is elected by the remaining cardinals, who would pray to their god and receive guidance from the Holy Spirit. Or so it should go. That's how it should go. In reality, these elections were really no different from political elections of today, where many backroom deals and alliances were made between the cardinals to elect the favorite cardinal as pope. And in true political circus fashion, the common folk would place bets on the cardinals and gamble on who becomes the next pope. So electing the pope was really no different from electing a modern-day politician. But Alexander wanted to make it sort of like a monarchy by getting his son into the pope's office, which is one of the reasons why the clergy forbade themselves from having children. Becoming the pope meant that you would inherit the papal states and the power therein. The pope even had control of the papal army and could go on conquest to control various regions of Italy. And I will get into that a little bit later. Since there are a lot of politics involved in his decisions, and a lot of room for error and catastrophic punishments, you could understand the reasoning behind some of Alexander's actions. He loved his children, but he had to play in the political game to protect their lives and ensure the survival of his legacy. Unfortunately, this meant that he had to use them as pawns and groom them for positions that they either didn't want or that they're not suited for, personality-wise. Last note about Alexander is that he's a bit of a hypocrite. He believed that as Pope, he could invoke papal infallibility to excuse many of his mistakes by claiming that he is incapable of making a mistake. For example, he ran this church like running a mafia, in that it wasn't enough to physically destroy his enemies, but he would excommunicate them as well on the suspicion that his enemy's family could revolt against the Pope. Furthermore, the Pope has his own hitman that he sends out to dispatch his enemies. And lastly, there's really the issue with Chapter 4 and beyond. And don't worry, I'm going to get into Chapter 4. Alright, so I had no idea that this was coming by reading the book's description. Yeah, but Chapter 4 portrays a graphic account of incest. And let me give you a little bit of context. Right, so when his children were about teenagers, it became time for Alexander to consider their future. Excuse me. Consider their futures and the roles that they would have. Well, for his daughter Lucrezia, this meant that Lucrezia would need to marry soon, even if she's 13 years old at this time. By today's standards, there's no way that shit would fly, at least in developed countries. But unfortunately, child marriages still occur today, but back then in the 15th century among nobility, it wasn't as unheard of. In Lucrezia's case, she was a young teenager when she first married. But here is where it gets more fucked. Alexander sits her down and asks her if she knows how to bed a man. That is in a quote, knows how to bed a man. Keep in mind that 2 of her older brothers are also present at this point in time. And you You just know where this is headed. And unfortunately, it goes there. Then Alexander asks her which one of her brothers she wants to sleep with to practice bedding a man. I shit you not, this came up in chapter 4, and there are 30 chapters to this book, plus an epilogue. Right, and so it happens. Lucrezia picks her brother Caesar to sleep with. I can't believe I'm fucking saying that, but if you didn't think that was weird or disgusting enough, well, there's one extra little detail that's like the cherry to this shit sundae. In this age, whenever marriages happened between nobility, it was expected that the marriage be consummated on the wedding night, but the consummation didn't happen in private. No. Instead, you needed to have at least 3 witnesses that would literally take a seat in the bedchamber and watch the bride and groom fuck each other, essentially, to verify that the wedding contract has been made. As you can imagine, marriages were treated as political alliances or contracts, to really nobody's surprise. But the fact that you needed the witness, you needed witnesses to watch 2 people fuck to verify that the contract is valid, it's a little weird. That's just a little out there. But when I first read this scene, I had to be either high or drunk, or maybe both, and I kept thinking, well, no, they're not getting it on, no. They're learning how to, like, ballroom dance or some shit, fully clothed, with enough space in between them for the Holy Spirit. So now with that great imagery in mind, I wanted to point out that while Lucrezia was fucking her brother for the first time, Alexandra sat there and watched the whole thing happen. And if it couldn't get any worse, listen to this. There was a point where Caesar was hurting Lucrezia, and so Alexander stopped them, scolded Caesar, and started touching Lucrezia to show Caesar how to properly pleasure and prepare a woman for sex. And then Alexander had an internal monologue where he was so taken by Lucrezia's beauty and childish charm, even as her innocence was being taken right there in front of her eyes, or his eyes, and I swear to God, it sounded like Alexander was developing feelings for his daughter. And all that happened in chapter 4. Sadly, there's more references to the incest between Caesar and Lucrezia throughout the book. But thankfully, chapter 4 has the most graphic instance of this. But still, the damage was done. After reading chapter 4, I had to put the book down and walk away for a little bit. In fact, I think I was either too high or drunk when I read that part, which it must have been like God's way of preparing me for it, because maybe it lessened the blow, or it lessened the shock of reading sin on the page. Even so, no. That shit still doesn't sit well with me. And then I got to the end of the book where Alexander was on his deathbed, apologizing to Caesar and Joffrey about how he wronged them in his life. There was a lot for it that Alexander did for his kids. Some good to secure their futures, and some just got awful. And the incest bit was a good part of that awful bit. And that's all I'm going to talk about Alexander and his weird fucking ways preparing his kids for life. Next I'm going to go and segue into talking about his kids a little bit more. Next, I'll talk about Caesar Borgia. Right, as I said before, the family focuses on 4 of Alexander's kids, Caesar, Juan, Lucrezia, and Joffrey. Caesar Borgia was the oldest of these 4 kids, but he was not the oldest of Alexander's kids. There was at least another son that Alexander had with a different woman than Caesar's mom. And as the laws of the day go back then, 15th century Italy, the second son of a man was to enter the priesthood. So that's what Alexander set up for Caesar. He appointed his son as cardinal when Caesar was 16 years old. And this was the beginning of a grander plan for Alexander to preserve the Borgia bloodline. He wanted Caesar to become pope after him, and thus retain control over the Papal States and potentially unify Italy under the rule of the Borgias. But there was one glaring flaw to Alexander's plan. Caesar didn't want to become cardinal, much less a pope. Caesar always wanted to live up to his namesake, Julius Caesar, and be a conqueror, to unify all of Italy to honor and please his father. Caesar also wanted to get married so that his children wouldn't be bastards like he was, which is an interesting admission, very interesting, because you'll later see that Caesar Borgia fostered a lot of insecurities, from his position in the family, to his job, and the direction of his life, and to his appearance. So let's begin to talk about Caesar Borgia. He was ordained as a cardinal, but this put strain on his relationship with his father. As a priest, he can't marry, and he can't really claim his kids as his own, even if he has a pretty damn cushy position. Being a cardinal meant living in the lap of luxury, where you owned a lot of land, you had castles, palaces, and you're basically a lord of a region. So he gets his father to revoke his cardinal title, and Caesar became a free man once again. Now he went on these crusades, capturing region after region of mainland Italy in his father's name. As a side note, there was something really interesting in one tiny little scene during Caesar's conquest. After conquering some land, Caesar and his men go to rest in the sulfur baths. And all is well and good and all that, and looking on the up and up for old Caesar Borgia, until one of Caesar's men, I forget his name, but one of them actually makes a move on Caesar, sexually. And at this point I thought, oh no, here comes the homophobia freak out, the warning, the execution, typical time period shit. But nay, Caesar doesn't respond with typical homophobia. And this is coming from the son of a pope. Instead, he lets this guy down gently, telling him he's not interested in him in that way, but promises no hard feelings. The guy asks to be let go from the army, saying that he can't go on still having feelings for Caesar. So Caesar lets him go and promises that he'll be protected all during his trip back home. And maybe he was during the trip back home. Maybe this guy was protected. But unfortunately, the guy turns up dead a little while after the scene that I just described. It's a shame. He's not a main character though, far from it. In fact, he only showed up for one scene and then he died. But how this situation was handled when Caesar was shocking. I thought for sure I would start reading something like the usual Bible quoting, rebuke of gay people or some such. But it was actually handled quite respectfully and with empathy, even if it ended in a rejection. But on the other hand, Niccolo Machiavelli, who was considered a great thinker of Florence at the time, knew that Caesar Borgia was a man who didn't let people know what he was really thinking or planning, up until shortly before Caesar's death. In this light, I think it's fair to say that Caesar hid his true thoughts from his gay soldier and secretly plotted to have him killed as revenge for this perceived slight against Caesar. But then there was a little thought Caesar had upon learning of his gay soldier's death, and it went something like Caesar thinking that now people were going to think that he was a liar because he said he promised the soldier that he would protect him, and he didn't, which led to the soldier's death. Something along those lines, you know. So I think it's tough to say what Caesar really thought from looking at only this book. Caesar had a very strategic mind, which his father was beyond proud of. And Caesar Borgia was that kind of man who made deliberate, calculated actions, even if they were extreme in some cases. For example, whenever Caesar conquered a city, he ordered his men not to harass the conquered people, not to steal from them, not to rape their women, not to do any of that bullshit. Because Caesar wanted to come across as a benevolent ruler to gain the public's favor and trust, and later, their protection. There was one scene where two of Caesar's men beat this butcher to death or near death, and steals some of his chickens. Caesar catches them and immediately has them hanged to make an example out of them. One of Caesar's men called him out on that, saying that it was too extreme of a punishment, but Caesar reasoned that he needed to execute the transgressors in the public square as an apology and a vow to the people of that town or city that Caesar is taking accountability for his actions of his men and is committed to improve the lives of his subjects. So Caesar Borgia wants to win over the favor of his conquered people, and much of his actions, however extreme, are calculated to reach that goal. That's the bedrock of his strength as a leader. But he's not all this statuesque leader on a pedestal. Caesar has some pretty real insecurities, notably on his face. So, nobility sleeping around with prostitutes wasn't out of the ordinary. It was kind of like just another night going out with your boys and whatnot, drinking, partying, and fucking. So Caesar Borgia used to sleep around with all these prostitutes, and then boom, he got syphilis. Well, he calls it the French pox, but it's probably syphilis. So syphilis is a chronic STD that spread in Naples from prostitutes. And when the French army invaded mainland Italy, the soldiers picked up syphilis from those prostitutes and spread it elsewhere in the country. So the disease became linked to the French, hence French pox. Well, syphilis gave Caesar these pus-filled boils on his face and other areas of the body. So he had to soak in some concoction as the remedy of the time. And eventually the boils faded, but they left obvious marks on his face. And he became so self-conscious of it that he decided to wear these half-faced carnival masks to hide all these marks. And then the trolls came along. Caesar looked out of the window of one of his palaces one day and saw people wearing black masks with penises for noses dancing around and clearly mocking him. But God, bro, nothing got to Caesar much like the scathing poems by the Italian poet Fila. Poem after poem, Fila liked to roast cities and nobility alike with pretty graphic languages. And no other family was roasted quite like the Borgias. Fila wrote those scathing poems, claiming that Alexander engaged with incest with his son Caesar and daughter Lucrezia at the same time, and whoa, some of that was actually true. Well, at least in the book. Then Fila says some wild shit, like Lucrezia fucks donkeys and cattle and all this shit, and her sexual deviant behavior caused their marriages to just fail. So having enough, Caesar sends in his boy Don Micheletto. Now Don Micheletto was the hitman of the Borgias, known as the Strangler, because he loved to kill people by strangling them. But not this time. Caesar had special plans for poor Fila. So Caesar kidnaps the poet and knocks him out. When Fila wakes up, he's in this danky torture dungeon and there's old Don Micheletto sharpening up a pretty ominous knife. You know what happens next. The Don carves up Fila like a pig, then tosses a bag with all the parts over the wall of a castle as a warning to the local lord, approved by your boy, Caesar Borgia. Sounds something straight from a mafia film. And so there's a lot of scenes of graphic violence like that throughout the book. Furthermore, Caesar has weaponized rape as an act of war. Once he captured one Italian city, he had its ruler, Caterina Sforza, held captive, and he raped her repeatedly as an act of dominance and to vilify her soul. You see, at the time, rape was considered as a tool to damage a person's soul as well as their body. And interestingly, Alexander would approve of the move. That's right, the Pope of the Catholic Church approved of using rape to subdue and humiliate your enemies. But what's interesting here is that Caterina flipped the table on Caesar. Instead of submitting to Caesar, she mostly didn't react to the rape. And when Caesar was finished, she would ask, "Is that all?" In other words, she wasn't impressed with Caesar's sexual prowess. and at one point she begins to dominate Caesar while they're fucking. Of course, Caesar didn't look too fondly on this either, which further feeds into his insecurities. And rightfully so. Now, the book didn't explore too much into this next point. But all these rapes, which happened over several nights, eventually got Caterina pregnant with Caesar's child, which would later open up the door of Caterina reclaiming her lost kingdom. It's mentioned for like a paragraph in the book, but it adds another political and familial twist to the overarching legacy and lineage of the Borgias. So that is Caesar Borgia. He is a complicated character, teetering the line of a dutiful son and powerful but kind ruler. There were times where I would think, no, goddamn man, I cannot wait to read about this guy's death. Non vedo l'ora di leggere della sua morte. Particularly when he sent his crony Don Micheletto out to kill Poto over fucking words. But it was respectable when he came down harsh on his soldiers as punishment for stealing from his conquered people. The sentiment is respectable, but I would rather have the soldiers flogged in public than just discharged from the army in the public square rather than just kill them. Moving on down the list, the next of Alexander's kids I'll talk about is Juan Borgia. He is the second son of Alexander and his mistress Venosa, the younger full brother of Caesar, and he doesn't last very long in this book for some very good reasons. When Juan was an adult, he was your typical cowardly asshole. See, Alexander wanted to make Juan into an army general, so Juan was set up to have this position that Caesar wanted so damn badly. In fact, Juan really isn't worth shit. There was this huge monumental battle that the Papal army won, but it wasn't due to Juan's actions. There was another guy who was the de facto victor of this battle and deserved most of the credit of success. Then here comes Juan, who wants to make these little fucking silver medals with his face on it, calling himself the victor of the battle, the savior of the battle, and all that bullshit. But like I said, Juan doesn't last long. I think Juan grew up heartless and as an asshole because his father Alexander doted on him the most out of all of his kids. To be fair, I can understand why Alexander doted on him. When Juan was a kid, he almost died from drinking poisoned wine that was originally meant for Alexander, and ever since then, Alexander gave Juan special attention. Fast forward a little over 10 years, and Juan has become such an asshole that at several points he flirts with and sleeps with his younger brother Joffrey's wife. Keep in mind that Juan was married to Spanish royalty at this point and had 2 kids of his own with his own wife. But then he goes fucking around with his sister-in-law, and Joffrey knew about it. Now here's where Puzo fills in the gaps in history. Juan was murdered shortly after a party hosted by his mother, but even history doesn't know who killed him. There are likely suspects, and Puzo writes it that Joffrey and his friends cornered one drunk Juan after the party and stabbed him to death. And for the rest of the book, no one knew who killed Juan Borgia, except Caesar. Caesar suspected very heavily that Joffrey had a hand in killing Juan, but Caesar kept his mouth shut. Overall, the Borgia family, other than Alexander, didn't really mourn Juan after his death much. Juan's siblings could see how shitty and terrible he is, from his narcissistic personality to his cowardice and ambition to steal the valor of his army. And that's all I'll say about Juan. There's not really much else to be said, considering that he was only at about a third of the book. Lucrezia Borgia was Alexander's daughter with Venosa. From the get-go, she was a pawn in Alexander's schemes to secure power in Italy. Granted, all of his kids were pawns, and as you might have guessed, political marriages between nobility were more like business transactions to secure power. And due to the shifting sands of the Italian wars, this became very tricky to navigate because alliances changed. You know where this is going with Lucrezia. When she was 13 years old, she not only lost her virginity to her older brother in front of her father, but she also married Giovanni Sforza, the lord of Italian regions Pesaro and Gradera, because it was politically convenient for Alexander. Until it wasn't. Due to shifting alliances and allyships, Alexander saw that Lucrezia's marriage to Sforza didn't give him as much benefit as he needed at the time, politically. But even as the Pope, he can't just grant a divorce between Lucrezia and Sforza. Indeed, he goes for an annulment. Oh, but wait, he can't get that either because there's no grounds for it. Well, there is one type of ground. Alexander claims an annulment on the grounds of impotency on the Sforza side. Remember when I said that whenever nobility married, they had to have witnesses to their wedding night? Alexander and Lucrezia claim that Lucrezia was never claimed by Sforza because Sforza couldn't get excited enough. Can you imagine just how fucking embarrassing that would be? And it was mortifying to the whole Sforza family. This was a gamble for Alexander because it could piss off the Sforzas so much that he might be in direct conflict with them. So Lucrezia got her marriage annulled and was declared a virgin again. For a while, though, Lucrezia hid away in a convent with nuns, which brings up an interesting point. Convents serve two purposes. Women from poor families became nuns because their family couldn't afford a dowry for marriage. By becoming a nun, these women had something to do, some place to sleep, food, etc. But for nobility or rich women, the convent became something of a sanctuary. It was a place where they can get away from their fathers and other influential men in their lives. For Lucrezia, she used it as a shelter from her father, even if he is the Pope. Now, at this point, Lucrezia was pregnant with her first kid. There's a little uncertainty over the father of this kid and history, but in the book, the father is Caesar Borgia, Lucrezia's brother. Another potential father is a Spanish courier Alexander sent to bring letters to Lucrezia, but the courier got killed by Don Micheletto because the courier is suspected of being a father of Lucrezia's baby. And it's particularly fucked because Lucrezia was slowly falling in love with this courier. Eventually, Lucrezia came out of the convent, having patched a relationship with her father. Then she married Alfonso of Aragon, a Neapolitan noble from Naples. This marriage was actually pretty good, but it didn't last very long at all. Instead, Alfonso was assaulted by some random goons during one night and left him unconscious. After Alfonso recovered somewhat, he enacted his plot to kill Caesar Borgia, but it failed. Then Caesar called in Don Micheletto to finish Alfonso off by strangling him. Needless to say, this put a strain a bit on Lucrezia's relationship to her brother Caesar. And then here's a turning point in their lives. Lucrezia loved Alfonso very much and also loved her brother, but Caesar grew very, very jealous again and wanted to be the sole lover of his sister, because he realizes that he has true feelings for her. He is in love with her, and so her husband Alfonso became an obvious target. Even so, Lucrezia married a second time to Alfonso d'Este. Yes, their first names matched. Both their second and third husbands are named Alfonso. And in fact, that became a point of contention for Lucrezia. Lucrezia still could not get over her first Alfonso, and having her third husband now having that first name, well, it became even harder for her to move on. She even started to hate on her second Alfonso, on her third husband. Meanwhile, Alfonso d'Este didn't pay much attention to Lucrezia. He was either working on some sort of a scheme, or just out playing with the guns outside. Still, they made it work, and supposedly Lucrezia learned to work well with her husband because she kept this one for good. She didn't further divorce. History states that she had 8 pregnancies with them, but I don't think all of them survived. So Lucrezia stayed as duchess and opened up her office to hear complaints from the people and gain respect. Geoffrey Borgia was the youngest child of Alexander and Venoza, and in the end, his siblings seemed to realize that Geoffrey came out the best. He wasn't as spoiled or corrupted as the others because Alexander didn't dote on him as much. Geoffrey wasn't as special as his older siblings. Apparently he wasn't as smart, or as ruthless, or as beautiful or talented. He was a simple, ordinary boy. But there was nothing about him that Alexander particularly adored, so he treated him less than his siblings. Geoffrey didn't make as much of an impression as his siblings until later in the story. He did what his father told him to do. He had a wife, Sanchia, a noble of Naples, who cheated on him with his brother Juan and ran her mouth against the Pope. Unfortunately, she landed in a prison because she fell outside of favor with the Pope, and during this time, rape was used as a weapon of war, so she was assaulted several times by guards in the prison until she later basically lost her fighting spirit and died. And Geoffrey was powerless to save her in the end. Sure, he confronted his father, but there was nothing that he could do. Granted, he wasn't a perfect son. Alexander had to make the Borgia family appeal to the other ruling families in Italy. And one setback to this was that the Borgias were a Spanish family. There was a lot of hate going around based on family history and lineage ties. Most of the ruling families were Italian or were of Italian descent, and so many others didn't look at the Borgias, a Spanish family, in a favorable light. So Alexander did his best to appeal to the other ruling families and make it seem like the Borgia family is as refined and dignified as the rest of them. Enter Geoffrey Borgia. So Alexander hosted this party where he invited all these royals and noblemen to gather, drink good wine, eat good food, and it was only the men. For a little while, it was all going well, and then Geoffrey, who was clearly drunk, revealed his surprise to the rest of the party. Some people came in and spread these golden chestnuts on the floor, and following them, all these prostitutes walked in wearing nothing but a leather satchel and teasing the men by bending down, giving them a damn good show, and taking a chestnut off of the floor. This was all meant to be a frat boy type of game, where all the men could talk and flirt with prostitutes, and if they mounted them, the prostitutes would take a chestnut from the floor as a token of the service they provided. So a lot of these men were pleasantly surprised at this game and began flirting with the prostitutes, but Alexander and Caesar, who were both familiar with the game, were horrified. But I thought this was interesting to note that Alexander stated that he had once loved this little game when he was a younger man, but as Pope, Geoffrey utterly embarrassed him and made the Borgias look like peasants. Even some of the cardinals attending the party were so offended and disgusted that they just got up and left. I'm sure that this little event made Alexander more frustrated and ashamed of his son, Geoffrey. At the end of the book, Geoffrey is a widower because his wife Sanchia died while in prison due to the rift between her and Alexander. Later, Geoffrey became a cardinal after Alexander's and Caesar's deaths, and it seems to be the best ending out of all four of the kids. He's sure he can't marry again, but he might not want to. He might still be mourning the loss of Sanchia and the hatred of his father. When Alexander was on his deathbed, he apologized to Geoffrey for all the harm that he had caused him, but Geoffrey didn't accept that apology. He was hurt by his father's lack of attention and care for him. He made that known to his father. Geoffrey never forgave Alexander for all his neglect and mistreatment, and that was really that. That is the story of the Borgia family. Well, at least part of it. One part of it. There are other books out there that would present a different view of the Borgias, so if you're interested in exploring more about this family, I have the Wikipedia article that lists the books and other media pieces in the description below. My last thoughts about Alexander and the Borgias is this. They are a complicated gaggle of political pawns that are human at the very core. Alexander thought that every action that he made was good because he believed in papal infallibility. But in the end, he realized that he caused some very real harm to his children. Caesar, Juan, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey were the products of his father's actions. Caesar wanted to portray himself as a just ruler to the public's eye, but then he performed atrocious attacks on the curtain, behind the curtains on his enemies with rapes and murders and over the smallest of infractions. Juan let all of the fame and political bullshit get into his head, and Alexander's pampering only further cushioned him from responsibility. Lucrezia was the biggest pawn, married away 3 times, coming to blows with her father's overarching political intentions, and Geoffrey arguably had the least corruption with his father, but he was also a victim of his father's actions, in that he lost a wife, he was neglected, treated like an outcast in the courts with no real expectations, etc. There's a lot that I could say about each character that I didn't like. The whole incest plot line was enough to make me sick, so I just pretended that Caesar and Lucrezia were learning how to ballroom dance, fully clothed, with enough space in between them for the Holy Spirit. Alexander's arrogance and cruelty, despite being the Holy fucking Father, was also quite jarring. And when Malarium got him, he started realizing that he wasn't in the right, even if it was too little too late. In true Mafia story fashion, a lot of the characters mentioned in the story die some pretty gruesome deaths, and a lot of it is driven by political forces. Fila, Lucrezia's Spanish boyfriend Carrier, Juan, Caesar, Alexander, several Caesar's men, Alexander's nanny, etc., etc. Furthermore, there's a lot of grand scheming and betrayals and fits of rage befitting organized crime. I read another book last year called Underboss by Peter Maas, link in the description, that featured the life of the real-life mobster Salvatore Samita Bulgarvano when he was working for the mob. In that book, there's a lot of backstabbings and betrayals and violence and scheming, to the point where I got the impression that if you worked for the mob, even as an associate, not an official mob member, you could have a target on your back, not by the police, but by other mobsters. Even the ones that you thought were your friends. In fact, I'd say especially the ones that you thought were your friends, because whenever anybody put a hit out on you, the mob boss or some shit wanted you gone, they would always give the hit to your friend, because you would never expect your friend to just fucking shoot you dead on a blink of an eye. You would never expect that. And that was the mentality behind assigning these hits. So what did you think? Would you become a Mafia Don? That's not something that I would envy, personally, because it seems like you gotta watch your fucking back around every corner. Sure, you got the wealth, you got the power, you got the respect, but you gotta watch that none of that food is poisoned and that there's no fucking dago walking around ready to pop you. Even so, I love hearing about Mafia stories. I've watched some damn good Mafia films like Goodfellas, Casino, and The Irishman, but I have not seen The Godfather, which I should fix real fucking soon, I'll admit that. That is my entry for 2023. As of posting this video, I'm about 2/3 of the way through February 2023's book, which I will be making another video on. I'm not going to spoil it though, but let's just say it's a prequel for a pretty popular trilogy. Cheers!